Hi, I'm Tom Carlo, General Manager of KPBS. Welcome to Community Conversations, educational discussions that explore the issues you care about. Our mission at KPBS is to provide San Diegans with stories that make us think, help us dream, and keep us connected. And we hope Community Conversations will help you gain knowledge that will spark questions, insights, and thoughtful dialogue. This program is made possible by Rady Children's Hospital Auxiliary and California State University San Marcos, and we are grateful for their support. And now I'd like to introduce Steve Dinkin, the president of the National Conflict Resolution Center. Steve?
Thank you, Tom. The National Conflict Resolution Center addresses issues in society through mediation, communication training, and restorative dialogue. Tonight's discussion will give you the opportunity to brainstorm solutions using the restorative dialogue process, facilitated by our trained staff who are respectful of all points of view. So thank you so much for joining us this evening, and please enjoy the panel discussion.
The divisions in American society were obvious even before the election of 2020. From Black Lives Matter to Blue Lives Matter, from QAnon to defund the police, and from fake news to fact-checking. Our differences seem starker than ever and perhaps even threaten our democracy. We will look into these issues and ask what we, as Americans, can do to move toward reconciliation. In tonight's Community Conversation, a joint project of KPBS and the National Conflict Resolution Center. Our host is Mark Sauer of KPBS News.
Thank you for joining our community conversation, Keeping Our Democracy, What Now? We'll begin with a moderated discussion among our panel of experts, then we'll open the conversation to your questions. Our panelists are political scientists. They are Professor Legina Goss of UC San Diego.
Hi.
Professor Carl Luna of Mesa College. He's director of the USD San Diego Community College District Institute for Civic Engagement. And
Hi,
Carl. Also, unfortunately, tonight, we were going to have Professor Tom Wong, also of UC San Diego Political Science Department. He's under the weather. We wish him a speedy recovery. So we're going to have a little more time for the guests we have and a little more time for your questions. So following the panel discussion, the National Conflict Resolution Center will facilitate smaller group discussions on Zoom. And we thank you for taking part in this community conversation. And without further ado, let's get started. We're going to start with a question about free and fair elections. And Carl, let's start with you on this one. Attempts to disenfranchise voters were widespread in 2020, as were attempts to subvert the results. With the election processes controlled by states and counties, how do we ensure fair elections in the future? And how do we ensure that everyone believes their vote will count?
You know, Tom, Mark, that's an incredible issue that we have to deal with, because in this election right now, there's 40 to 50 million Americans who don't think it was a fair election. I don't know how much of that is lip service because their side lost, or how much of that is really gut felt. Had the election gone the other way, if Joe Biden had lost to the Electoral College, we've seen the same thing occurring. What we need to do from top to bottom is first start re-educating Americans about how the system works. I was thinking Michael Vu, our registrar, worked so hard to really get out to the community how they were doing this process with the thousands of people involved, and how fraud on a meaningful scale is just not possible. I was thinking maybe they need to put together like a little animated, like a health ed class movie, like we saw back when we were kids, just to show this is your ballot and this is what will happen to it. Because when people don't know how the system works, they are prone to all the disinformation.
And Legina, your take on this one.
Sure. I want to start by talking about the first part of your comment about how disenfranchisement, a lot of effort to keep people from voting in this election, was a pretty big conversation this year. And it's true. There was a lot of attempts. There was a lot of court cases, a lot of challenges to try to make it more difficult for certain people to vote. But also, I don't think those attempts are really new. And even more importantly, this was probably one of the most secure elections we had in a really long time. Even recently this week, we had the Department of Justice talk about how secure this election was. And hopefully him saying that, right, being someone who is in the executive branch or from the Trump administration, might convince people that the elections were in fact fair. But as Carl just said, a lot of people may not believe it just because they didn't win the election, kind of a sore loser scenario. But another scenario is that partisanship was, in general, determined a lot of people's understanding of what was going on in this election. And maybe if we remove partisanship from the equation, that could help improve people's understanding or faith in the electoral process, right? So if you think about it, in most states, elections are administered by people who are elected to office based on their partisanship, or elected officials appoint them. So state secretaries of states or state legislators that draw congressional districts. And perhaps if those administrators, the people who decided the way elections would take place, were nonpartisan, or even better, were multi or bipartisan, then people would have faith that their interests were represented in the way that the elections took place. And this could also increase trust, because a lot of times there's lots of research that shows that people don't really trust politicians from the other side, or even better, they're more likely to trust the people that they elect into office, even if they're doing the same things that someone else might have been doing. Criticism is leveraged more often on people who aren't elected by individuals, right? So perhaps if we increase the representation of people's partisan interests on the boards and on the commissions and in the among the people who are actually deciding how elections are run, then people will have more faith. And I absolutely agree with Carl that transparency is also really important, so that people understand how the process is taking place. But even with that, it seems that people don't trust that the information that they're being given is in fact true because of some of the things I just mentioned.
Right. We're going to get back to that point in a bit in another question. Carl, I want to pick up, before we leave this question, on something Legina just said, and that is about how elections are run at the local level. Is it time to have these federal elections run by a federal commission that's bipartisan and take them away from these secretaries of state who might be a candidate and might actually run the state's electoral process?
Yeah, Mark, I think you've got a point there. Now, as Legina pointed out, there's really two issues here. One is, how do you count the votes? And I think you could get all the secretaries of state across the political parties all out there agreeing with a concerted campaign between now and 2024 to really argue to their partisans on both sides. The votes, once they're cast, are going to be fairly counted. It's really that first part, though, that Legina was pointing out, the attempt to keep voters from being able to vote. With state election laws, which vary by state, how you get to register, how you get your ballot, you get to cast your ballot, that becomes the real issue. The voter fraud, if there is any, is the fraud of millions of voters who have a much harder time voting than they should. Now, what you need to do is to go to a national system, but we're a federal system, and given the way the Senate works, given the way the states preserve their own integrity, I think the better thing you might be able to do is just to vote out a big ton of money to the states to really run from the federal level, give them money to run really good elections, and also give them some incentives to get the most people possible fairly and legitimately registered. Time's going to change a lot of this anyways. Demographics in America switch. But in the short term, you've got to be able to run elections which people have confidence in, and money could help that.
And Legina, just before we leave this one point, Carl brought up a point that got me to thinking about the fraud was ahead of the election. We had President Trump, and we'll get more into this later, was talking about it's going to be a fraudulent election. Even Attorney General Barr was saying mail-in ballots are fraudulent on their nature. Did that kind of poison the well months before we even took the vote?
Yeah, I think it was purposeful in an attempt to poison the well. I think there were concerted efforts to make people have less faith in the election, so that if the election didn't go in President Trump's way, that he could leverage challenges and look legitimate in his efforts to do so. But also, I believe that that's why it's necessary to kind of remove partisanship or add more partisanship into the ways that elections are structured, so that one party can't only pursue electoral strategies that would allow them to win elections.
All right, let's turn now to American racism. People of color, whether native born or immigrants, have always been subject to barriers, exclusion, indignities, hardships, and violence, blacks especially. What do we need to, excuse me, what do we need to change socially and politically so that we, the people, means everyone? Regina, start us off on this one.
Sure. I think one of the starting points is to think about what it means to be American and what we, the people, mean. And there's research in political science and psychology that shows that when people are asked what American looks like, a lot of times it's white people. Whether they are American citizens or not, they're more likely to be considered American. And anyone who doesn't fit that image is given a lot more distrust. People don't believe them as often. They're thought of as not as intelligent, not as trustworthy, not as honest, just not as good, right? And so this colors a lot of interactions that occur. So a lot of conversations over the last several years have been talking about policing, but it also colors the way that prosecutors pursue cases, the way that jurors decide guilt or innocence, and even sentencing. And then it's also in the way that other types of institutions in society exist. There's a way that teachers teach, social workers, politicians. Most of us have biases that are associated with this understanding of American equals white. I remember reading the Brown versus Board education, and they relied on this study in psychology where they asked little children to think about like what a good or a bad person was by giving them these dolls, right? And they were more likely to think a white doll was good and a black doll was bad. And that was regardless of the race of the children they were talking about. So these biases don't just exist among white people, and they don't exist among everyone, right? But there's a strong association that really colors the way that politics works, the way that society functions, and the way that individuals interact with each other. So the first step, I believe, in dealing with American racism is to challenge these beliefs, right? And one way that we've thought of a good way, I guess, was to do it was to think about colorblindness, which is an attempt to see everyone as equal, which I think is maybe a misstep, right? Because if we only look at people and assume that there are no differences, then we really dismissed a lot of the different lived experiences that you talked about, Mark, when posing this question, right? The fact that some people really do have different realities that make it more difficult for them to do things, that make individualism really difficult, right? So institutional racism that exists that really puts people at disadvantages. So before we address inequalities, we have to first acknowledge that they exist in the first place. We have to acknowledge that racism is a thing. And maybe the second step is to think about how we can challenge these through representation, right? If we put people in positions of power, authority that were particularly historically held by mostly white men, then we can start challenging our beliefs about what it looks like to be a good person, smart, have good leadership, right? And it's interesting that a lot of these conversations about representation tend to go into these conversations about identity politics, right? So because people question people's abilities and their capabilities, there's tends to be a greater scrutiny for people who aren't normally in these positions, right? So if there's a woman or a person of color, a Black person, they're more likely to have their record challenged more than if it was a white male, right? And there's been a lot of conversations, even thinking about the previous elections, where if you look at Donald Trump's qualifications before running for office compared to those of Barack Obama or Hillary Clinton, he looks on paper a lot less qualified for office, but there were a lot less concerns that his election was just about identity, when in a lot of ways it was, right? He represented a identity within society that people believe should be in those positions. And then there are also people who are concerned about identity politics because they think that having, I guess, a symbolic or a token representative doesn't actually lead to better policy or better situations, which could be true. But when you think about it, one person can never represent everyone. One person can never truly represent all interests, right? So it's true that one person may not represent the entire group well, just because the group is very diverse. And we need many different types of representation and many different types of people to challenge this association that we the people only means white people, right? And so that means having Black conservatives, having Black liberals, having Black people and a lot of different identities representing interests or representing our interest in government or showing up in leadership roles and employment or even on television to really challenge our associations about what it means to be American or what we the people should represent. And the last point I'll make on this is that we can't really wait on a consensus to make change. A lot of times people have a challenge to trying to challenge racism by saying people aren't ready for it. But a lot of the times that we've had the most progress towards change has happened despite public opinion. So I don't think public opinion is the best way to think about ways towards improving our representation or addressing racism, whether individual or systemic.
All right, Carl, I want to give you a crack at this. President-elect Biden has a very diverse so far. We haven't seen, certainly by any means, all of his appointments, but it's looking a lot more like America, I think, as his administration starts to take form. What's your take on this question?
Well, and in saying that, Mark, that's what, how to say this, scares part of the other side. It's not their America. You have a big hunk of America that lives in areas which are disproportionately white, rural areas that don't have a lot of cultural diversity to them. And they have been led to associate their own economic decline over the last 30, 40 years with the fact that other people are now doing better. What do you do about this? I'll go back to Cyndi Lauper, money changes everything. What you got to do is get prosperity, widespread prosperity up. So the rising tide's going up. Once you have some people coming down, while other people seem to be coming up, they get that correlation for going back to George Wallace, that because Black workers were making more money finally in the early 60s, white workers were losing money because of mechanization. It was affirmative action and all that was causing the problem, not globalization, not changes in the overall economy. I mean, I'm an Italian American. Here's the funny thing. We weren't white as a people until after World War II. When my father was in the Deep South for the war, he was exposed to all kinds of prejudices against Italian Americans, African Americans. Remember, we only have Columbus Day because in the 1890s, a lynch mob lynched 11 Italian American citizens for the death of a local sheriff, which they had nothing to do with. And the nation of Italy threatened war unless we did something. And that's how we discovered Italians and made them part of the narrative. You've got to bring in a narrative in which everybody's prospering, has some sense of common identity with, as Legina's saying, maintaining all the glorious differences we have, the food court model, but you still have everybody going to that food court and enjoying it. It's going to take a decade or two to dig ourselves out of the economic hole we have of economic prosperity only flowing upwards. Once you got more widespread prosperity, hopefully by the end of the decade, it's remarkable how a full stomach and happy bank account can moderate some of these issues over time. At least one would hope.
Virginia, before we leave this question, I wanted to touch on something that Carl said, and that is when and how will we ever see diversity as a strength, not a threat to certain parts of American society?
Yeah, I do think a lot of it has to deal with people's own understanding of their economic situations, right? So when people are having less economic prosperity, they tend to challenge or scapegoat or blame, I guess, other people who aren't like them, right? So a lot of it is in times of prosperity, it seems that there's more community building and more respect for differences. But when there's seems like there's more zero-sum games, then that's when you do see a lot more conflict. And I mean, another way that there tends to be more, I guess, cohesion is in times of when there's a common enemy. So in times of war, though I don't think anyone is really advocating for that type of event in order to bring people together.
Well, we'll see what happens. Of course, we're all rooting for a cure. I hadn't thought of it till just now that the vaccine may help us in regards to race relations, in addition to getting rid of this terrible virus, hopefully. Well, let's move on here. We're going to talk about facts versus disinformation. And central to the current division in American society is that facts are no longer regarded as truths by everyone. Science is disdained by millions. Bizarre conspiracy theories gain traction. Whether facts are acknowledged as true often depends on political belief these days. How can voters know which sources are reliable, and what if they just don't care? Carl, I'll toss that to you to start with.
All right, to know what sources are reliable, watch KPBS, of
There
course.
you go. Thank you very much.
And then watch Fox News, and then watch MSNBC, and then read the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times. Sample a lot of different media. If all you ever get are things that agree with you, you're watching the wrong stuff, because nobody's right all of the time. If it challenges you, you got to buck up and face that and try to see why people may have different views than you. Now, that being said, most Americans don't spend their time watching NPR, KPBS, reading the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal. They're living their lives, and they pick up stuff on the side. They get it off their Facebook and their social media streams. I swear, social media is the lead in our society's water today, like from ancient Rome. There is so much stuff which gets attention because, again, dog bites man, no story. Man bites dog, but man's part of the conspiracy to enslave children and steal an election. That gets all the attention. Facts are often not as sexy as fiction, which is why we watch dramas. How you combat that? Well, you've got to start looking at things like the equal time law. If you're using broadcast bandwidth, that is a taxpayer, that is a public trust, you should have to use it properly. You are not allowed to pollute the waterways with chemicals. You shouldn't be able to pollute the bandwidth with things which simply aren't true. Drive it off to the sides of the discussion, not the centerpiece. I do not think it is a coincidence that about 30 some years after we got rid of the equal time rule with the rise of AM talk radio, that we're in the situation we are today, because AM talk radio is not there to sell facts. It's there to sell my pillow. It's there to sell a whole bunch of products, and you get those products sold by just being outrageous.
Legina, a point I wanted to pick up on was one thing Carl had said, and that is you take these crazy theories. QAnon's a perfect example, but there's a number of them now. This whole fraud in the election we were talking about, it used to be fringe stuff at the edges, and now it's really front and center. We can't agree on facts. We got a crisis, a public health crisis here. Certain percentage of the population thinks it's a hoax yet. Climate change, another perfect one. It's a hoax. The scientists, the facts are overwhelming worldwide from scientists in the know. What do we do to combat this?
Yeah, I think Carl is absolutely right that a diversity of information sources is really important. One problem, he blames social media, but I think the reason social media kind of gives people the news they want is because people want the news that they want, right? They want information that confirms things that seems to fit in their understanding of the world. And anything that doesn't fit with that, they discount it. They don't necessarily, or we don't necessarily want to challenge things or our understandings of the world. So when coming across information, even in this world where we might only get things that we agree with, the first thing I think is really important to do is look at the source of that information to understand what the qualification that individual or that institution has to make the claim. And then figure out how they got to their conclusions, what their evidence is, what their experiences are, how those led, and then find other people from different sources, different types of experiences, and see if they believe the same thing. If everyone's saying the same thing, but they're all the same type of person, then maybe the information isn't correct. But the other part that you just mentioned is this concern about, the distrust of people that we don't agree with, right? So it's and believing these conspiracy theories, right? And I think a lot of that is motivated. I just read this article recently on meta perceptions, which is basically about how when someone looks at another group who isn't like them, they tend to overly have over perceptions of that group's negativity about them, right? So if I'm a Democrat, I think Republicans dislike me a lot more than Republicans actually do. And that makes you not want to listen to what they have to say, because no one wants to talk to someone who doesn't like them or is always telling them that what they think is false, right? So maybe one step towards helping people agree on facts and believe less these conspiracy theories is to really get over or find a way around these misperceptions that people have about people with views who are different from them, right? So not necessarily finding common ground on the issues, but finding common ground on our mutual respect for each other, understandings of us, of people who aren't like us, because it seems a lot of that might be motivated by just because of the hurt and pain from difficult conversations that have happened in the past, adding extra negativity to the way that they may think of me as an individual. So maybe one of the first step or a crucial step is really dealing with the way that people relate to each other, more so than trying to, or in addition to trying to address how people understand facts.
And I did want to remind our audience in a few minutes, we're going to take some questions from you. So please get ready and fire away at us on those. Carl, I wanted to pick up on the whole idea and the notion of gullibility. You know, the old idea that I was born at night, but I wasn't born last night. You got to show me, I'm skeptical. People seem to just swallow things whole, that you just say it and let's see, we're, top Democrats, celebrities are stealing children and cannibalizing them. That's at the heart of the QAnon theory. You've got members of Congress now who embrace that theory. How did this happen?
Well, in part, I think it's because, we, the experts, have kind of betrayed the other 80% of the society. Top 20% of America has been doing pretty good the last 30, 40 years. And the experts come up with ideas of how to keep things going. And the macro economy is looking good. The overall system seems to be working, but a lot of people are simply being left behind or having a hard time moving forward. I mean, I was supposed to have my Buck Rogers jetpack by now. Science solved the easy stuff in the 20th century when it took care of things like antibiotics, refrigeration, and we doubled the lifespan. The last 30 years, science is now up against things like the big C, cancer, and it's taking longer to get a payback. So a lot of people are saying, look, my standard of living is stagnant, or a bunch of Americans are dying younger than they used to. Our life expectancy actually went down in the double aughts, for heaven's sakes. That being the case, they say, well, science isn't helping me, so at least I can believe in theories that make me feel good if science can't deliver. What you need to do, again, I hate to keep harping on it, but get people's quality of life up by finding ways that we can improve healthcare, we can improve economic productivity, and keep a handful of people, my peeps and above. Top 1% takes the big hunk, top 20% takes what's left, and not much goes to the bottom 40%. How we reach that sort of social justice is going to be predicated on how we organize our overall economy.
All right, Legin, a couple minutes before we want to turn to the audience questions. I wanted to give you one last a crack at this before we leave this subject on gullibility. Just concerned about how people just buy into some of this crazy stuff. And even with COVID, you've got cause and effect. It's a hoax. It's a hoax. I got sick. I still believe it's a hoax.
Yeah, and I think maybe one of the issues is calling it gullibility, right? I think we're all in these information chambers where the people we're around are all saying the same things, right? So we may look at someone and say, like, where did you get this from? This came out of nowhere. I know no one who believes that. Where they're looking at us to say, like, everybody I know is saying the same thing, right? So why are you kind of calling me, like, I guess, gullible, right? And that's where it's really important to try to diversify our information sources, but also to not, I guess, blame people or scapegoat people for the misinformation that they do believe, and do better at trying to build trust so that when people do receive information, they're not just thinking that the person who's sharing it is trying to get over on them or trying to manipulate them into thinking things that aren't aligning with their understanding of the world and understanding of all the people who they relate with on a daily basis.
And if
All
I
right.
could go in there, Mark, just real
Sure,
quickly,
sure.
the saddest thing I heard all this terrible long year is the story of people that are dying in places like South Dakota, North Dakota, in COVID wards, denying with their last breath that they have COVID because their whole worldview is on the verge of being shattered in their last moments. We need to get that out as ads to people. I mean, we're a society of marketers. Market the truth. Science has to learn to do a better job of marketing the truth. Academics have to. Because if we think people are just going to listen to us because of the degrees, that day is long past.
All right, let's turn to some of our questions here. Our first one up from Facebook from Duke T. Wants to have you folks weigh in on Measure B, the Commission on Police Practices in San Diego. Virginia, you want to start with that? Is that going to be a good reform?
Yeah, honestly, I don't have enough information to try to weigh in on that. So I'll let Carl answer that if he has more.
Well, and in fairness, they're just getting started here, and it's going to be, according to UT story this week, a long process to even get it up and running and see what it's going to look like. Carl, your thoughts on the Police Commission on Police Practices?
Well, I mean, it's like chicken soup, Mark. When you got a problem, you form a commission, and then they study it, and then they come up with something, and then 2 administrations later, it gets buried. I mean, we need more than just, oversight for what happens after the fact. We need to look at police practices. The defund the police issue is problematic with a big hunk of America because, oddly enough, we do need police. That I was just giving my lecture today to students on one of the functions of the state, and the very first one, social order. Every society's got cops. How do you make them work for everybody and not just enforce prejudices, stereotypes, and take the easy way out? That's a problem. Oh, by the way, nothing that helps: money, pay for better people, and you get better services. Oh, when you talked about a national election commission, I was watching some British crime show, and I discovered in England, there's only 14 police jurisdictions, and everything ultimately reports to Scotland Yard. We've got 5,000 police departments in America. You don't think that's going to produce all kinds of problems? We need to streamline the whole structure and delocalize it so it is more subject to oversight outside of the community.
Can I respond to that, Mark?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, on this idea of commissions and defund the police, I do think it's a misstep that the first way that the first response to big social problems is commissions, right? And as Carl said, commissions are very old, right? There's lots of commissions, lots of reports that already exist that have already diagnosed many of the problems that currently exist, right? Having more information is always a good thing. Having a commission alongside other efforts to address things that have already come up is really important. But commissions as a first step, as an only step, is definitely the wrong response. Also with this, the conversations around defund the police, right? There's a lot of criticism about the phrase or that conversation, right? Or understanding what defund the police is. For the most part, very few people are asking that there are no police officers or that there aren't people who are able to maintain social order. A lot of the defund police conversations are about things that police officers have asked for a long time. And that's that they don't do jobs that they're not trained for, right? So that they're not being asked to be social workers, being asked to be mental health providers, being asked to be deal with children who just need oversight at the moment, right? Police want more help; they need more help. At the same time, even the jobs that the police should be doing, there does, as Carl said, need to be more oversight, and there needs to be more accountability for the interactions, and also for the way that we think about the role and purpose of policing, right? Maintaining social order is one thing. Protecting, I guess, economics or wealth is very different. And so a lot of the conversations for people who do want to get rid of the police, it's more on that part, right? They don't like the police as serving interests of people that don't look like them, and they rather have an institution, a law enforcement agency or community that is able to protect everyone and not just certain people within the community.
All right, let's move to another question here. We've got one from Kathy Dunn, a nurse. Sad question, really. I personally have been so disappointed in and lost my faith the basic goodness of the American people. How can we move beyond this in 2021 and beyond? I'm going to take a guess here and maybe think she's referring to the fact that masks are such a proven and factual way to knock down this virus and flatten the curve, as we hear about, and so many people have politicized this, unfortunately. Gina, start with that one, and Carl weigh in on this as well.
Sure. I mean, we are definitely kind of seeing the worst of humanity at the moment. It seems, right? The distrust, the lack of coming together, and I think a lot of it is built out of anxiety. We're not used in modern society. We're not used to dealing with a lot of anxiety, a lot of conflict, a lot of concerns about where food's going to come from, or shelter, or whether we can interact with our family members. And there's just been a lot of that over the last couple decades, right? This pandemic in itself is a culmination of like a long years of things that have really been affecting people. Carl's talking about the inequality that has happened, polarization over the same time period. But then these health crises that keep coming up, and people aren't really used to that. And so maybe a focus on coping mechanisms and trying to, instead of our knee-jerk reactions to blaming people for issues, really trying to come together and address them as a community instead of just pointing fingers.
Carl, your thoughts on that?
Well, this is one of those cases, though, where the historical figure stands at the center of all this. Bottom line, if President Trump had worn a mask 9 months ago and told everybody else to do it, his party, everybody would have been wearing them and all the MAGA colors they could have had, and we wouldn't have this problem. What he did is not going to be judged well by history, but that's where we are. He politicized it. Some of his base wouldn't have liked it. They would have said, oh, that's, my personal freedom. No, you don't have the freedom to give other people a disease. I don't have the freedom to drive 100 miles an hour on the freeway. I don't have the freedom to go out with COVID and breathe on you. We failed in that basic civics lesson in our schools for a couple of generations now, that people think the me is important. Remember, there's no me in we the people. On the left, you're still going to have a problem when the vaccines do come out. Remember the anti-vaxxers, that's the other side on the left of QAnon on the right, and you're going to have 30% of the population that's not going to get vaccinations. I'm really fearful what's going to be required is a hard-learned lesson where we're going to lose a lot more people that shouldn't have died. And maybe at some point, our humanity reasserts itself when enough of us have actually seen that suffering and go, what the hell were we thinking about? How can we do better? This is going to be the teachable moment of the next 20 years.
All right, let's shift gears here. And this is kind of an encompassing question from Jenny Prisk. Jenny, if you're out there, I remember you well, worked over the years with you. I've lived in San Diego 37 years, currently live in New Zealand because of COVID. Are you studying other countries' media platforms to find good practices to emulate? Carl, start us off on that
one. What was the line from Admiral Stockwell? I'm out of ammunition on that one. I have not really dug into, like, if you're talking about media platforms, I'm not quite sure what you mean.
I think what she's saying is, are we seeing this kind of stuff that we're talking about, this mistrust and fringe theories into the mainstream and all this stuff in other countries here, or are, they have the internet, they have social media, or is it American phenomenon?
Remember, New Zealand had a terrible mass shooting, Norway had a terrible mass shooting, and the alt-right is a global phenomenon. Fascism and neo-fascism is going to be currently the biggest challenge to liberal democracies as we move in this century. These are people who are saying, I want to go back to a glorious past. I want an all-powerful state to protect me, and we'll throw everybody else under the bus. So these movements are not unique to the United States. You've got it in Canada. You've got it in Mexico, Brazil. Look at the number of strongmen, the number of populist demagogues that are on the rise. And China is mutating into more of a state capitalist authoritarian Nazi, let's just call it a neo-nationalist sort of system. It's going to be a rough 2020s. I'll just be honest with that with everybody. The 2030s, 2040s, 2050s are going to get better, but we've dug ourselves into this hole over the last few decades, and it's going to take a decade of prosperity, of people trying to come together to solve problems, particularly with these huge pandemics we have. And this will not be the last pandemic, to be sure. That's the price tag of globalization. We're either going to come together as a planet, or we're going to set ourselves back a century or two.
And though it's interesting, the leader in New Zealand, you make that point, also was given great credit. The numbers there are very low, and she did what you were talking about that Trump failed to do, which was wear a mask, lead on this issue, have crackdowns, and have a good campaign that people bought into. The same thing after the shooting there, where they had some meaningful gun control reform. We only have a few minutes left here, so I wanted to move on to a question for Regina. Rodney W. asks, with the history of medical experiments performed on people of color in America, how do we reassure the people of color the vaccine is safe?
Yeah, that's been a huge issue and a conversation that I've heard a lot. And I think it also relates to something that Carl reminded me is that populism isn't just a thing on the right? There's been this anti-establishment sentiment in a lot of different countries, and it also deals with kind of people of color and the way they think about governments and also the medical profession, right? So there's still this distrust of these institutions, and also with how quickly the vaccine came to place, there are a lot of people who are just really nervous about the implications of a vaccine. And a lot of it's just going to take, some of it's going to take some blind faith. And then a lot of it's also going to take our leaders really doing a better job of communicating, of providing people better information when they say things that are not as well informed or aren't well researched or factual, and really doing things to demonstrate trust. And it's not going to happen immediately, right? Trust is built over time, and it's really going to take a lot of time for people to have more faith. And unfortunately, because of the history of experimenting on people of color in the United States, and even those populations would benefit the most for the pandemic because they've been affected more, there is a lot of people who are just very nervous about taking a vaccine and it not actually promising or delivering what it's supposed to, or even making things worse than they might already be right now.
Carl, I want to come back to you on this next question from Sandy P. Any advice for having productive discussions with friends and family who are misinformed?
Avoid the issues they're misinformed at, develop trust with them, and talk about things you can't agree with. And once you get people on a roll agreeing with you, it's easier to recircle back to some of the problematic areas. Bottom line, if you get into confrontation over these things, it's just not going to play out. It's kind of like over your Thanksgiving dinner table. How do you talk about politics? You don't. We're too divided right now as a society. We're going to need the next 6 months just to recover from the stress of COVID and the Trump years and the election and all the rest. Sometime spring, summer, fall, maybe then we can start going, hey, look, people started to wear masks. COVID cases went down. Got the vaccine, people stopped dying. And then what was the old line from Schopenhauer? Truth is first ridiculed, then violently suppressed, then it's accepted as intuitively obvious. Yeah, we need to get to the other side of this to get to the intuitive obviousness of the science.
And Legina, there's a related question here. Richard Phil, is not this current situation a reflection of the general dumbing down of America? A large percentage of Americans don't believe in evolution, etc. We talked about climate change, the hoax with the COVID virus. Have we gotten dumber? Are public schools failing us over the last decades?
Part of it might have to deal with public schools. I think a lot of it has to deal with the onslaught of information that people have available to them, right? In good or bad ways, right? Having more information allows you to consider lots of other opinions, but sometimes it leads to accepting opinions that aren't actually truthful. And I don't know that it's necessarily people aren't able to understand truth, but I do think a lot of it is just partly being in information silos, the people around us saying the same things, but then also access to a lot of different authorities on information, right? Your teacher isn't the only one who's telling you how the world exists, right? It's not just your family. Now you also have lots of lots of television programming. You have a cell phone, you have internet, a lot of different sources that allow you to seek the information that makes us feel better.
Hey, Carl, I'll give the last toss to you. We're almost out of time on this segment, but it occurs to me, if you're going to be President Trump and accusing a lot of people who work very hard in a public health crisis to work on elections, to count votes, long hours, many of them, if you're going to accuse them of fraud, you should have some evidence at some point, because this is a very serious charge and a federal felony. When are the folks at the top, the leadership in this country, claiming fraud? When are they going to have to put up or shut up in this situation?
Well, it's kind of like saying if you're selling a steak as the absolute best steak ever, you better be sure it is the best steak. That's not the art of the deal, Mark. The art of the deal is you sell your success and you criticize anything that challenges it. That's what the president brought us to. That's what made him big. He is the biggest salesman, if not con man, we've ever had in elected office. That being the case, here's when things will change. Over the next year or so, a lot of other people than Donald Trump, the Republican Party, want the nomination in 2024. To be able to get it, somehow or other, they got to throw him under a bus or move him into retirement. Fox News is being threatened by OAN and being threatened by Newsmax. Fox is going to have to strike back. And the way they're going to have to do it is to grab that more larger center audience. And I think that marginalization of the extreme right and the extreme left already happens. That I think it may move us back toward the center if there's prosperity, we get over COVID and the economy continues to grow. If we have a depression globally in the 2020s, all bets are off. And that's why I always keep circling back to macroeconomics, people. It's the economy that you've got to look at that fuels that. People will accept other ideas like evolution if it helps them to live longer. Otherwise, it doesn't matter to them.
All right, we are out of time on this one, and I want to thank everybody for watching this part of our conversation, and thanks to those who submitted questions. Many thanks to our panelists, Gina Goss of UCSD and Carl Luna of Mesa College. We invite you to join the National Conflict Resolution Center to continue this conversation among audience members and panelists.
Thank you so much again to our panelists and moderator for thought-provoking discussion. And the conversation isn't over yet. Each of us has our own connection to this topic, and we benefit as a community when all of our voices can be part of the conversation. I'd like to invite you into the second part of the event today, where you can share your thoughts, reflections, and personal perspectives on the conversation you've just heard. Join me and a wonderful team of facilitators from the National Conflict Resolution Center by clicking on the link below. You'll be whisked away to a Zoom room to add your voice to the conversation. Your perspective, your experience, and your wisdom are important, and we hope to see you there.